The first combat sortie of the Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft took place on September 17, 1941. On that day, squadron leader Clerc took off with the task of photographing an area on the French-Spanish border, where British agents had reported suspicious movements, presumably of German troops. The mission could not be completed because the generator failed near the target area, and the airspeed indicator was also not working. After landing, the cause of the malfunction was quickly discovered. A bee had entered the air pressure sensor. Nevertheless, Clerc and his navigator, Sergeant Sauverboots, eagerly recounted to their comrades the 3 unsuccessful attempts by German Messerschmitt fighters to intercept their aircraft. They chased us with the same success that half-dead mongrels would have chasing a pedigree hound, Sauverboots claimed. 3 days later, a reconnaissance sortie flown by Flight Lieutenant Taylor proved far more successful. This extraordinary pilot became the first officer in the British Royal Air Force to be awarded 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses. Just over 2 months later, Taylor's aircraft, by then under his squadron command, was hit by anti-aircraft fire over Norway. The pilot directed the burning aircraft into the open sea so that the Germans would not gain even the wreckage of a Mosquito. Neither he nor his navigator stood any chance of survival in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. The severe shortage of aircraft in the 1st Reconnaissance Unit required the conversion of some 4th Series bombers into reconnaissance planes. The first such converted aircraft took off in April 1942. The conversion of another 26 machines into the reconnaissance version was carried out between December 1942 and March 1943. Later, the aircraft were delivered mainly to No. 540 Squadron. A little earlier, in October 1942, the first of 5 Mosquitoes of a new modification took flight. It, too, was converted from a bomber, but equipped with high-altitude Merlin 61 engines with 2-stage superchargers. Due to the underdevelopment of these engines and the decision to install them primarily on Spitfire fighters, this series turned out to be very limited. The Royal Air Force received only 1 such aircraft per month, the last being delivered in March 1943. The next reconnaissance aircraft was created on the basis of the 9th modification bomber, fitted with Merlin 72, 73, 76, or 77 engines. While the bomber version had a fuel capacity, including external tanks, of about 840 gallons, the reconnaissance version's capacity was increased to approximately 1,160 gallons. In the latter case, 2 120-gallon tanks were suspended under the wings, and the aircraft's takeoff weight reached about 2,500 pounds. This version became the heavyweight champion among Mosquitoes, yet its range was extended to almost 2,500 miles at a cruising speed of 250 miles per hour. De Havilland immediately received an order for 375 reconnaissance aircraft. In April 1943, the Hatfield factory produced the first 4, followed by 6 in May, and in August and October, the Royal Air Force received 25 of this type each month. Already in May, the aircraft were delivered to No. 540 Squadron. By this time, the Americans had developed and supplied their British ally with a night photography bomb 3 times more powerful than the British equivalent. This illuminating bomb fit easily into the Mosquito's bomb bay, allowing for night aerial photography from high altitudes. By November 1943, 90 high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft of this version had been delivered to combat units, after which production ceased. At the same time, serial production began of the most numerous reconnaissance variant of the Mosquito. This was a new version based on the 16th modification bomber. The power plant remained unchanged from the 9th version, but the cockpit was made pressurized, which significantly improved crew conditions at high altitudes. In developing this new version, the company made extensive use of experience gained in creating the high-altitude night fighter and, in particular, the first pressurized Mosquito, which had first flown in August 1942. The prototype of the new reconnaissance version made its maiden flight in July 1943. On one of its sorties, the aircraft climbed to over 39,000 feet. Unlike the bombers, reconnaissance aircraft were not fitted with enlarged bomb bays. The fuselage and wing volume was sufficient to house 3 cameras and additional fuel tanks. The side windows of bomber cockpits had convex blister panels for better visibility. On the reconnaissance versions, another blister was added above the navigator's seat. The aircraft's normal flight weight was about 21,900 pounds, with a maximum of approximately 23,900 pounds when carrying 2 120-gallon drop tanks. These aircraft were delivered to No. 140 Squadron in December 1943. Units equipped with reconnaissance Mosquitoes of this version first entered combat in February 1944. The aircraft remained in serial production until the end of the war. A total of 435 aircraft of this type were produced. In autumn 1944, the company built 5 reconnaissance aircraft of a new modification, which differed from the previous ones by an increased wingspan of nearly 59 feet. The power plant consisted of 2 of the latest Merlin 113 and 114 engines. The aircraft had to be made as light as possible for operations above 39,000 feet. The empty weight of the reconnaissance plane was about 14,300 pounds, the normal flight weight approximately 20,500 pounds, and the overloaded weight with 2 120-gallon drop tanks about 22,100 pounds. It was believed that this lighter aircraft with powerful high-altitude engines could not be reached by German jet and rocket fighters. However, these hopes proved false. In the winter of 1944-1945, some German interceptors patrolled over Berlin at an altitude of around 41,300 feet. The last serial version of the reconnaissance Mosquito was the variant with Merlin 114 engines. Some aircraft with engines of this modification were given a slightly different designation by name. This variant was intended for extremely long-range flights. A huge fuel tank in the protruding bay under the wing made it look similar to bombers adapted for carrying 4,000-pound bombs. 2 additional drop tanks of 60, 120, or 240 gallons could be installed under the wing. The total capacity of all tanks reached 1,525 gallons. Fully fueled, the aircraft weighed 25520 pounds. To increase the service ceiling of this variant, it was necessary to abandon armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Instead, the maximum range of such reconnaissance aircraft at an altitude of 24,600 feet reached 3,570 miles. In this regard, the Mosquito almost matched pre-war transatlantic aircraft. The photo equipment included 4 cameras for vertical photography and 1 for oblique photography. By the end of the war with Germany, no more than 50 machines of this type had been built, and the total production amounted to 181 aircraft. A small number of these aircraft managed to take part in operations against Japan. Of the aircraft produced in Australia, 6 were converted into photo reconnaissance planes and another 21 into training aircraft with engine replacements. The photo reconnaissance aircraft proved to be the most useful for the Royal Australian Air Force during the war. The internal fuel tank capacity of these machines was increased to 763 gallons. In fighter bombers, it was only 615 gallons. With 2 120-gallon underwing tanks, the maximum flight range reached 2,980 miles. The photo equipment included 3 cameras for vertical photography and 2 for oblique photography, and the aircraft carried no armament. Unlike the British reconnaissance planes, the Australian machines retained an unglazed nose section of the fuselage, which was used to house 2 photo cameras. At the outbreak of war, Great Britain had virtually no modern specialized reconnaissance aircraft. Therefore, it was urgently necessary to convert various machines, including the Spitfire fighter. Despite its advantages, high flight speed, decent altitude capability, and relative inconspicuousness due to small size, this reconnaissance variant had 2 significant drawbacks: a relatively short flight range and limited onboard equipment, which included only 1 oblique camera. By refueling in the Shetland Islands, Spitfires could reach as far northeast as Trondheim, and from bases in southern England they could reach Spezia and Genoa. In Europe, however, many areas remained inaccessible to them. For this reason, the appearance of the reconnaissance Mosquito was awaited with impatience. On the sunny morning of July 13, 1941, 8 months after the first flight of the Mosquito, the prototype reconnaissance aircraft landed at the Benson airfield. A month later, the first photo reconnaissance squadron already had 3 machines at its disposal. The first impression of the reconnaissance Mosquito among the squadron's pilots turned out to be very positive. Jeffrey de Havilland Jr., who visited this unit, wrote in his report, "In my memory, this is the only aircraft on which flights from the very beginning were not regarded by pilots as a deadly stunt." The engineers and technical personnel, however, were much less enthusiastic. The young technicians saw in the all-wooden construction the company's outdated tendencies and disapproved of them. However, over time, most of the technical staff changed their opinion of the Mosquito, being convinced of its reliability, strength, and maintainability both after accidents and when battle damage was present. From September 1941, Mosquitoes of the 1st Photo-Reconnaissance Squadron began carrying out combat missions, often flying at maximum range. Among the most notable successes of this period was the photographing of the battlecruiser Gneisenau in Kiel, damaged while breaking through the English Channel on February 22, 1942, and later the confirmation of intelligence, first obtained by Spitfires, on the presence of the similar ship Scharnhorst in Wilhelmshaven. The difficulty of such missions can be judged from the memoirs of Flight Lieutenant Merrifield. On March 3, 1942, at 10:25, we took off from Leuchars Airfield with the task of photographing targets in Copenhagen, Danzig, Gdynia, and if possible, Königsberg. Taking a course for Copenhagen, my aircraft climbed over the North Sea to an altitude of 2,000 feet. We crossed the Danish coast near Esbjerg, photographing the city and port through breaks in the clouds. After that, we headed toward Copenhagen, climbing to 21,000 feet. Soon, solid cloud cover at low and medium altitudes completely obscured the ground. Copenhagen was closed, so we turned toward Gdynia. The cloud cover beneath us began to decrease, and we were able to observe the surface of the Baltic Sea with large, drifting ice flows. Behind us stretched an intense contrail. I climbed another 900 feet, and it became weaker. After nearly 3 hours of flight, we crossed the coastline again. Approaching Gdynia, the cirrus clouds completely dispersed, and the entire target area lay in plain sight. Flying over Gdynia with the cameras operating, I noticed the contrail had again intensified, so next time I made the pass at a slightly lower altitude. Then we headed toward Danzig and photographed the whole city and port twice. The next objective was Königsberg, which we also photographed, including its airfields, from an altitude of 21,000 feet. The excellent visibility allowed us to see up to 100 miles away. From there, we could even see Lithuania. On the return journey, we encountered a strong headwind. We had to descend to 16,200 feet and switch to the first supercharger speed to save fuel. Fortunately, the wind weakened, and we again reached the Danish coast at 16:30, photographing Esbjerg once more. An hour and 40 minutes later, our aircraft landed safely. The description of the 8-hour flight given in English is very restrained, but it is worth noting. For at least 7 hours, the Mosquito could easily have become the victim of German fighters, which undoubtedly had been alerted. Visibility of more than 160 kilometers in the Königsberg area with its airfields placed the reconnaissance aircraft in a difficult position. Here is how Merrifield described his close acquaintance with German interceptors a month later. We were flying at an altitude of 49 to 40 meters over Trondheim when I noticed in the rearview mirror a Messerschmitt 109. He was about 1.5 kilometers away from us and about 150 meters higher. A thick black trail stretched behind the fighter. Apparently his engine was working at full power. I immediately increased the engine revolutions to 3,000 per minute, switched to the first supercharger speed, closed the radiator flaps, and put the aircraft into a dive. My operator reported that a second Messerschmitt was hanging on our tail slightly to the right of the first. We descended to 3840 meters and switched to level flight, but probably could not shake off the pursuers. Observation in the rear hemisphere was complicated by the fact that the enemy aircraft stayed directly behind the tail of the Mosquito, where the smoke trail from our engines lingered. After 15 minutes of chase, the pursuers were no longer visible, so I reduced the boost and engine revolutions to 2,700. Suddenly, the operator reported that he noticed a German who had broken off to the side. As it turned out, he was flying only 365 meters behind us, but for some reason did not fire. I again increased the revolutions and steered the aircraft toward the nearest cloud, into which I dove 10 minutes later. Upon returning to the airfield, the left engine had to be replaced. In total, during the first year of active combat operations, the 1st Reconnaissance Unit carried out 208 combat sorties and lost 5 of the 18 Mosquitoes available. On the modified aircraft, cameras with a focal length of 915 millimeters were installed by the technical personnel. The armament of the former fighters was not removed. They received a new designation, while the former bombers received another one. With these cameras, from an altitude of 7,000 meters, it was possible to obtain images at a scale of 1 to 8,000, clear enough to identify the type of military equipment. The new cameras allowed the Admiralty's keen interest to be satisfied when on aerial photographs of Gdynia and its seaport, it was possible to confidently identify the unfinished aircraft carrier Graf Zeppelin, and the battlecruiser Scharnhorst with its dismantled forward turret. On July 8, 1942, the first shuttle reconnaissance flight of a Mosquito to the Soviet Union took place with the task of photographing the Narvik area, where the German battleship Tirpitz was believed to be based. At that time, Boris Lukmanov, a Russian émigré, was flying as operator on one of the aircraft of the 1st Reconnaissance Unit. Together with pilot Victor Ricketts, on July 11th, he did not return from a combat mission. The Tirpitz successfully hid from the eyes of British photo reconnaissance. Therefore, in August, a special reconnaissance unit in northern Russia was sent on the ships of the next convoy to the USSR. Landing at Vyenga, the pilots of 3 Spitfires began flights as part of Operation Jupiter. In the following month, they were joined by the Mosquito of Squadron Commander Young, who flew to the Kola Peninsula on his own. Noticeable results were not achieved during that period, and already in October, the Spitfires and Mosquito returned to England. In the same month, it was decided to expand the 1st Reconnaissance Unit into 4 independent reconnaissance formations. The first of them became the 540th Squadron, consisting of 2 flights. Flight A continued to monitor the activity of the German fleet in Norway, while Flight B operated over southern France, Italy, and even over North Africa, where it periodically encountered opposition from the former Allies, the French. At the beginning of 1943, the 540th Squadron received 2 of the 5 reconnaissance aircraft of a new modification, which were modified earlier versions with more powerful engines and 2 227-liter drop tanks. These machines only partially plugged the gap that had appeared in the combat strength of the squadron due to the mass failure of old aircraft of the first modification. Up to 50% of the early models turned out to be unfit for flight because of rot in the 7th fuselage frame and also in the wooden rudder leading edges. The second wartime winter was endured by the early models with great difficulty. The imperfect drainage scheme let them down. On March 2, 1943, an aircraft of the new modification became the first reconnaissance plane to appear over Berlin. This flight passed without particular incident, but in the next one, Commander Young personally had to test the strength of the Reich capital's air defense system. First, he encountered massive fire from medium-caliber anti-aircraft artillery, and then several fighters tried to intercept him in succession. At an altitude of 7,800 meters, the Mosquito, with engines roaring at maximum power, reached a speed of more than 650 kilometers per hour and successfully shook off all its companions. In May 1943, reconnaissance units began to receive aircraft of an even newer modification with more advanced engines. Outwardly, they differed from their predecessors by the presence of a protruding blister in the canopy roof above the operator. The establishment of serial production of these machines made it possible to form another squadron, the 544th. From October, its aircraft regularly appeared over Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Romania. Taking off from English airfields, they landed in southern Italy. The aircraft flew to their targets at an altitude of 9,000 meters with a speed of 550 kilometers per hour, which made their interception extremely unlikely, until the Germans introduced jet fighters. One of the most important tasks for the Mosquito reconnaissance units in 1943 was monitoring the development centers of the German wonder weapons. In April to June, during the inspection of the Baltic Sea coast, the rocket testing range at Peenemünde was discovered. In the June photographs, specialists noticed 2 objects that looked like large jet projectiles. Later, they were identified as V-2 ballistic missiles. The information obtained was sufficient to organize a massive raid of 600 bombers on Peenemünde on the night of August 18th. As a result of the strike, the assembly plant and the research center suffered serious damage, which slowed down the work on the V-weapons. In the morning of August 20th, a Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft flew over the range again and delivered to England control images of the destruction. Bomber Command was fully satisfied with the results. According to intelligence data, besides the large ballistic missile, the Germans were also developing a flying bomb of relatively modest size. Its launching installations, as reported, were located in the town of Zempin, near Peenemünde. In aerial photographs taken on October 3, 1943, in the specified area, strange structures in the shape of ski ramps were clearly visible. Thus, the intelligence data received confirmation. That same month, similar structures were accidentally photographed in France in the Abbeville area. This news greatly alarmed the British command. Within the framework of the specially planned Operation Crossbow, Mosquito and Spitfire reconnaissance aircraft began carpet photography of the entire territory of northern France, Belgium, and Holland. Another reconnaissance unit, the 140th Squadron, was re-equipped with new Mosquitoes. On the photo mosaics obtained through joint efforts, specialists discovered numerous ramps oriented toward Great Britain. It became clear that the Germans had practically completed the development of the flying bomb, which later became known as the V1. Winter once again brought technical problems. The carburetors of the Merlin 72 engines began to freeze, causing engine failures at high altitudes. In 5 experimental flights over Scotland at an altitude of 29,500 feet, with an outside temperature of minus 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 cases of engine stoppage were recorded. Moreover, on one occasion, both engines failed, and the crew had to abandon the aircraft. Flights with the 9th variant were temporarily suspended. The aircraft had to be urgently modified by installing a device that preheated the fuel before it entered the carburetors. The difficulties were overcome by the end of January 1944, and the 9ths resumed reconnaissance flights. In December 1943, tests of the G differential range navigation system began on the aircraft of the 544th Squadron. The onboard equipment recorded the time intervals between the arrival of coded pulses from 3 radio stations located in England. By using 2 intervals, the position of the aircraft east of the island could be precisely determined. On special maps, lines corresponding to specific interval values were drawn. By interpolation, the operator could determine his position. And in the 540th Squadron, which together with the 544th became part of the newly created 106th Photographic Reconnaissance Group, other technical innovations were being mastered. The Buzzer and Rebecca devices were intended for detecting operating German Würzburg and Freya radar stations of the Reich's air defense system. 8 Mosquito aircraft were equipped with Merlin 76 and 77 engines and pressurized cabins to increase the operational altitude of the reconnaissance missions. On the eve of 1944, the 140th and 400th Squadrons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, and in January the 4th Squadron, received their first Mosquito aircraft of the 16th modification with Merlin 72 and 73 engines. However, the aircraft turned out to be unfinished in terms of design and production and were practically unsuitable for combat use. Due to the lack of a cabin air heating system, after an hour of high-altitude flight, the crew could hardly stop shivering. In experimental flights, the 16ths easily reached an altitude of 36,000 feet, but could not remain there long due to canopy icing and the risk of frostbite to the crew. About 20 such aircraft were transferred by the British in reverse lend-lease to their American allies. The Americans included them in the 654th Squadron of the USAF in Great Britain and used them as pathfinders, leaders guiding the main forces. For this purpose, the Americans installed navigation radars on some 16ths and naturally solved the comfort problems for the crew during long flights. The British themselves managed to eliminate the defects of the 16th modification only by May 1944. However, even after the improvements in the 544th Squadron, it was believed that the 16ths, in terms of overall flight and technical characteristics, were inferior to the 9ths due to their greater flight weight, poorer visibility, and other issues. According to the pilots, at altitudes below 36,000 feet, it was quite possible to use oxygen masks without resorting to the installation of a bulky and heavy pressurized cabin. Over time, the 16th modification received the restoration of the blister over the operator's station, which crews favored, improved adjustable air heaters and cabin pressure regulation systems, Merlin 76 and 77 engines, and an electrothermal anti-icing system on the canopy glass. All these measures contributed to restoring the prestige of the Mosquito as a reconnaissance aircraft. The crew's desire to have a lighter aircraft did not go unnoticed by the designers of the de Havilland Company. In April, several aircraft of the 140th Squadron were equipped for night aerial photography. They were fitted with K-19 cameras and the 2nd modification of flash equipment, which allowed photography even on moonless nights from altitudes of 2,950 to 4,920 feet. The Americans adapted the Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft to carry 12 M46 bombs, each of which produced a short but powerful light flash with an intensity of 700,000 candles. In the summer of 1944, the nature of the missions carried out by Mosquito reconnaissance squadrons underwent significant changes. The Allied forces had landed in Western Europe. They required detailed information about the positions of numerous small enemy targets, such as troops in dispersal areas, fortification systems, artillery firing positions, and so on. The only way to improve the quality of photographs was to reduce the altitude of photography. Pilots of the 140th Squadron proposed a new tactic. Their Mosses approached the target at an altitude of about 20,000 feet and dived to 9,000, 10,000 feet, reaching a speed of 415 miles per hour at the exit from the dive. This reduced the time spent on the combat course and decreased the likelihood of interception by German fighters. The direction of the dive was chosen in advance so that the reconnaissance aircraft could immediately head toward English airfields. In some cases, homemade solutions were used. Cameras or movie cameras were mounted inside fuel tanks, of course empty, adapting them in this way for photography during a dive. The Mosquito photo reconnaissance planes photographed not only the coastline but also the territory deep inside the expected landing area, and they did this repeatedly at 2-week intervals. To mislead the enemy, flights were carried out over areas far removed from Normandy. Spitfires, for example, often appeared over the Pas-de-Calais area, demonstrating supposed Allied interest. More than one pilot died in such demonstration flights. On July 25, 1944, the Mosquito of Flight Lieutenant A. Ewell from the 544th Squadron was intercepted for the first time by a German Me-262 jet fighter in the Munich area. The Sturmvogel carried out 6 attacks but still failed to destroy the British aircraft. Ewell brought the Mosquito, which had received several hits, to the Italian airfield of Fermo. Sometimes British reconnaissance aircraft escaped from even more difficult situations. 2 months later, in the same area, the Mosquito of Flight Lieutenant Watson came under attack by a pair of jet Messerschmitts. The reconnaissance plane was flying at an altitude of 29,000 feet when the operator warned Watson of the approach of Me-262s from Augsburg. For 15 minutes, the jet fighters alternated in firing practice on the unfortunate Mosquito, which barely dodged cannon bursts. This time, high-speed qualities could not help. It was clear that the German aircraft were much faster. What saved the Mosquito was its excellent maneuverability. Throwing the aircraft from turn to turn, Watson descended to treetop level. The Me-262s carried out attack after attack, each time ceasing fire at a distance of about 1,000 feet. The British pilot dodged the cannon tracers, a couple of times grazing the nose glazing of the fuselage against treetops. After the flight, mechanics pulled pine needles and small branches from under the frame. In the end, the Germans lost patience, or ran low on fuel, and left without shooting down the lucky Mosquito. On September 11, 1944, a Mosquito of the PR16 modification, as part of a large bomber group, flew to the Soviet airfield of Yagodnik, Kola Peninsula, to participate in a strike against the German battleship Tirpitz. It was necessary to determine the exact location of the heavy ship, which the Germans carefully concealed. The mission was both dangerous and difficult. In addition to natural obstacles, difficult terrain, frequent low cloud cover, there were artificial ones, a powerful air defense system, and smoke generators covering the anchorage of the battleship. During the first reconnaissance flight on September 14th, the Mosquito was hampered by complete overcast. The next day, the fjord was covered with a smokescreen. On September 16th, anti-aircraft gunners of the naval base reached the reconnaissance plane. It returned to the airfield with 5 holes. Only on October 29th did another Mosquito manage to take a promising photograph of the battleship from an altitude of only 5,000 feet, but it did not return from the next flight. Another Mosquito sent on reconnaissance discovered its wreckage in Tromsø Fjord near the Tirpitz anchorage. In November 1944, the 540th and 544th Squadrons received PR32 aircraft. Their ceiling exceeded 41,000 feet, and their high flight speed, 18 miles per hour faster than the PR16, made the new reconnaissance plane practically invulnerable to any enemy fighters except jets. The record for the largest number of combat sorties belonged to one of the PR16 aircraft. Over 1.5 years, its crews flew 67 dangerous missions over Germany and the occupied countries of Europe. The aircraft served with the 544th Squadron. Painted entirely in blue, it carried no fuselage code. At the very end of the war, the code L1 was painted in black on the left side of the fuselage. next to the national insignia. Like the early 16s, the PR32 aircraft were not without flaws. Their engines often overheated, glazing iced up, and ventilation and cabin heating systems worked poorly. On these hand-built machines, the defects were mostly eliminated by early 1945. Soon it became clear that the lightened high-altitude reconnaissance planes would face tasks far removed from reconnaissance. On the contrary, their mission became to ensure the secrecy of operations carried out by the British leadership. At the end of autumn 1944, these aircraft were involved in a special operation under the code name Frugal. These were high-altitude, non-stop flights from Great Britain to the Soviet Union to deliver diplomatic mail. Initially, the postal Mosquitoes landed at the Ramenskoye airfield near Moscow, and later the Vnukovo airfield was used. On the way there and back, the Mosquitoes were repeatedly attacked by German jet and rocket fighters, but none of these Courier planes was shot down. In total, the Mosquitoes carried out 27 such flights. During the Yalta Conference of the leaders of the USSR, USA, and Great Britain, this experience was repeated. This time, the Mosquitoes landed at the Saki airfield in Crimea. The flight routes under Operation Recon passed either through Malta or through Egypt. In the final period of the war, reconnaissance Mosquitoes usually met little serious resistance from the Germans. The Luftwaffe was no longer what it had been. In 4 months in 1945, the aircraft of the 540th Squadron flew 393 combat sorties, while losing only one machine. Still, in individual cases, crews found themselves in very difficult situations. In March, the aircraft of Flying Officer R. Heinz was attacked by 2 German rocket fighters at once. The British reconnaissance aircraft was flying at about 30,000 feet when a pair of enemy interceptors caught up with him with fantastic ease. Heinz rolled the aircraft and dived to 15,000 feet, during which his Mosquito reached almost 480 miles per hour on the instruments. However, the rocket fighters, of course, flew faster, and they were not so easy to shake off the tail. Soon, the Mosquito's right engine, which had taken a direct hit, caught fire. Heinz reduced the aircraft to very low-altitude flight and began maneuvering, evading attacks and trying to hide behind natural terrain features. Finally, the rocket fighters broke off. But then a conventional piston fighter appeared. It made 3 attacks and scored several hits. Shortly after, for reasons unknown, it ceased attempts to destroy Heinz's aircraft and flew away. A wounded operator could not carry out navigation, so on top of all other misfortunes, the half-damaged Mosquito flew at low altitude over the anti-aircraft batteries of the city of Kassel and sustained additional damage. Heinz, nevertheless, managed to make it to the French city of Lille. The next day, the brave airman was awarded the Flying Cross for merit. At the very end of the war, a number of aircraft of a new modification with phenomenal range were delivered to the 544th Squadron. However, this range turned out to be practically unnecessary in Europe, since only a small part remained of the once vast Third Reich. More as an experiment than out of real necessity, the squadron set about modifying these aircraft, suspending under the wings a pair of additional fuel tanks of 240 gallons each. The Mosquito was turned into a flying tanker with a capacity of around 500 gallons. Such aircraft found limited use over the Pacific, where fighting was also entering its final phase. The 684th Squadron managed to fly these Mosquitoes in combat conditions. The range and ceiling of the new Mosquitoes allowed for many things. Thus, on one of the flights, Squadron Commander K. Andrews managed to take several remarkable photographs of the world's highest mountain summit, Everest. The novelty lay in the angle of the shots. They were taken from above. Within the United States Army Air Force's mainly reconnaissance variants of the Mosquito were operated. They noticeably outperformed the American reconnaissance Lightning in range and ceiling. In addition, 36-inch focal-length cameras could be easily accommodated in the Mosquito's fuselage, cameras that could not be fitted into the nose compartment of the American machine. Under the original agreement, the USAF expected to receive 120 Mosquitoes, of which 90 were to be Canadian-built. One of the first to receive aircraft in February 1944 was the Weather Reconnaissance Squadron of the 802nd Reconnaissance Group of the 8th USAF, based in England. The machines were slightly modified, with American instruments, a radio station, and a radio altimeter installed. The squadron carried out meteorological reconnaissance in the target area 10 or 15 minutes before the arrival of the bombers. One of the meteorological squadron's aircraft was mistakenly shot down by an American Mustang, after which the tailplanes of all other Mosquitoes were painted bright red. The 654th Squadron, which performed night reconnaissance flights over Germany, had 12 Mosquitoes equipped with radar. 11 aircraft received American night cameras and a small bomb bay for carrying 7 photo-flash bombs. Another 12 photo-reconnaissance Mosquitoes in the 25th Bomb Group of the 8th USAF were converted into chaff dispensers. These machines carried in the bomb bay 2 wooden containers filled with strips of metallized tape, a total of almost 600 pounds of material for blinding enemy radars. And a quartet of completely black Mosquitoes from the 422nd Bomb Group had a completely unique task. During Operation Red Stocking, these aircraft were used to receive radio reports from agents of the Office of Strategic Services operating in enemy territory. A place for a radio operator was fitted in the bomb bay, and the appropriate equipment was installed, including a tape recorder. Aircraft received from Canada, 34 in total, were used by the Americans only as trainers, since by 1944 their flight performance no longer met the requirements of the time. 16 such machines were assigned to the 25th Bomb Group for training flight crews and to save engine hours on the few newer models.